And
It looks like we just have Kathleen come on.
Hi.
Hi, Kathleen. We're
Hello,
just
I'm
getting
coming from
started.
Brown Deer. I'm all good. All right.
You're from Brown Deer. Great. Thank you.
if we could get you to just type in the chat box your name, your role in the school that you serve, and the
Got
school that you
it.
serve, everybody, that would be fantastic. It's a way for us to kind of keep track and helps us target what technical assistance we deliver. And like I said, it is recording, so these will be posted on our website and the video resources in the next couple weeks. So thank you for joining us, and we promise we will be done by 1 o'clock to honor your time and the other commitments that you have. But what we wanted to do today is the second part of our Tier 2 Sustainability and Fidelity series. So schools that have been implementing for a while and just kind of want to review some things, have some conversations about adaptive parts of your Tier 2 system. That's what we're here to do. Our contact information is on the screen. You can always find us either through email or through the PBIS Network's website. And it kind of gives you a chance to touch bases with either your tax or us, or getting to know the rest of us around the state that are doing some of this. So today's session is really intended to kind of move a little bit deeper into the Tier 2 conversation than we did last time, if you were on last time joining us. Last time we kind of reviewed the big ideas behind Tier 2, not necessarily from a technical standpoint, but more from an adaptive. So kind of talking about how Tier 2 feels in the building, how it affects climate, how it affects culture, those kinds of things. So today we're going to move a little bit deeper through this and have a little bit more of an adaptive conversation around the basic Tier 2 interventions. We're going to start by reviewing kind of the big ideas behind check in, check out. But before that, we also want to talk about the necessary conversations that happen as a part of the Tier 2 system. And really, depending on when you were trained, how you trained, if you were trained under the Illinois model or Wisconsin's model, this is kind of a chance for us to get everybody on the same page from an adaptive standpoint about what we've built and why we do things the way that we do it. Before we jump in, Emilie, anything you want to add?
Nope, but if I'm just reviewing who's checked in so far. Thank you to Stacy and Kathleen and Elena. Thank you to all three of you guys for putting down your role. If you would not mind also, if you could just add your email address, that would be fantastic. I'm just gonna make sure that we document everybody's information. We've got it all down here. So thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. And really, this is intended to be a conversation. Neither Emilie or I are real formal. So if you've got some things that you want to talk about, please feel free to jump in, interrupt us at any point. This is really intended to kind of help provide that information that you're looking for. So to get started, we really want to talk about the conversations that happen specifically at Tier 2. And how the conversations at Tier 2 are an extension of Tier 1, but also lead into eventually problem solving and Tier 3, or individualized support for students. If you think about where your school came from with Tier 1 and what's happening or what should be happening at Tier 1 right now, the Tier 1 system, the Tier 1 conversations are going to continue to happen driven by the data. What is going well in our building? What are the needs of our building in terms of grade level data, school-wide data? It helps drive, what we need to teach. It drives how we need to support our staff. And it kind of gives us an idea of how well our universal instruction is working. We should be seeing that about 80% response rate to our universal instruction. As we move into the Tier 2 aspects of our framework, there's two main conversations that should be happening at Tier 2. and those help maintain the integrity of the interventions. It helps us problem solve our system conversations or our system needs, and it eventually leads into designing interventions for students one student at a time for those that don't respond to everything else. You may have seen this conversation chart, and there's a couple things that show up on here. We're going to be paying attention right now over the course of today to the top row and to the center of the yellow graphics. We're going to talk about the conversations, and we're going to talk about check and check out. But understand with this chart that there are two things that are being communicated. The top row is really about how the adults in a building collaborate, provide support, use data, and action plan. The information that's on sort of the bottom row, so where we have the interventions identified, we have brief FBA, BIP, those are all practice aspects. How we identify students, what those interventions look like at a universal level, what the interventions look like at a tier 2 or secondary level, and ultimately how we start moving into individual support. From an intervention standpoint, tier 2 is not a linear sequence. We're not looking at first check-in, check-out, then SAIG, then mentoring, then individualized check-in, check-out, then FBA, BIP. What we're wanting to do is create within our intervention systems, as we kind of talked about last time, a primary intervention that the majority of students are going to have contact with that will work for the majority of students that have that contact, and then the ability to differentiate. If it's a skill deficit, a performance deficit, or an engagement motivation issue. We're not wanting to put a student through 7, 8, 9 different layers of interventions before we start problem solving. We want to really be strategic and targeted in what we do and how we do it so we can respond to student needs quickly. So we're going to kind of take this conversation chart and hone in on the top row. The tier 1 system that we talked about is really going to continue to operate looking at the system data, the overall number of office discipline referrals, minors, attendance records, all of that good universal data that you have is going to be used by the tier 1 system to figure out what's going well, what do we need to maintain, and where do we need to focus our continuous improvement efforts. At tier 2, there's two conversations that happen. There's the general system conversation that looks at essentially system aspects. We're looking at how effective each of the interventions is that we've developed and put into place. So in training, we talked about that as the 70% rule. We talked about if we have 10 students in check and check out, is it working for 7 of those 10? Same thing for SAIG, same thing for mentoring, same thing for a brief FBA process. We're always looking at the integrity, the fidelity of the interventions. Are we seeing the response rate? But we're also going to be looking at other aspects of our system. We're going to be looking at the number of students that are potentially entering into interventions. We're also going to be looking at the number of students that are fading from intervention. So if check in, check out worked for Timmy, we know we got Timmy that is fading and moving to self-monitor. The system conversation is really intended to make sure all the logistic needs and the accountability needs of the system are getting addressed. The other part of the tier 2 conversation that we have is a problem-solving conversation. So for the student that really is needing more than check in, check out and something else, or whatever your gateway intervention is and something else, that's then where we're going to start talking about, all right, so what do we need to plan for the student individually? This has historically for schools been one of those spots that's a challenge to implement, because as schools, we've delivered our universals really well, and then we've jumped to individualization for students that have not responded. So creating the system aspects and assessing the health of the system and assessing the fidelity of general interventions is sort of a new concept, and it's sort of one that is hard to put into place and hard to establish. The second thing that we want to look at are the practice pieces, because at Tier 2, we know that they're extensions of Tier 1. So for our interventions to work at Tier 2, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, we need to make sure that the interventions, the instruction, all of those other system pieces, reteaching, acknowledgement, the use of data, the strong, solid, universal instruction are in place. Because if we're not teaching to fluency what's expected, and it doesn't matter the grade level, right? At high school, we're still going to be teaching to fluency what's expected in order to be successful in our settings. We're going to teach those things to fluency. If we don't, our gateway interventions aren't necessarily going to work as well as they should, right? Because having a gateway intervention implies that the universal is operating the way it's intended to do. Because when we talk about check and check out in just a few minutes, we're not doing anything new with check and check out or with academic seminar or whatever our gateway intervention is. We're providing additional instruction, additional practice, and additional support. If the students aren't taught it in the first place, those additionals aren't going to make as big of a difference as we would like. Anything you want to add, Emily?
No, I think that was good. Thank you.
So then as we start thinking about the middle part of this graph, the interventions themselves, the data is going to dictate a lot of what we do and how we do it. So the first thing that we're looking at, and we talked about this last time, are the data rules for entry into your primary intervention. For most schools, that's going to be check in, check out. For high school, it might be something like academic seminar. But what we're going to be doing is looking at the data and saying, essentially, what is the need that the majority of students present with, and how do we plan for that to ensure effectiveness and efficiency? So assuming you're in elementary or middle school and we're using check in, check out as our gateway intervention, we're going to have a data rule that says, these are the students that we want to start scooping up and putting into the intervention. These are the students that are just beginning to struggle, that are just showing that they need a little bit more than what Tier 1 by itself is providing. We're going to have that 70% rule to determine whether or not we're delivering the intervention with integrity. So again, we should be seeing about 70% of students in the intervention respond to the intervention. If not, that goes back to that system conversation. What do we need to find out? Do we just have some really tough kids that are in there, and we've identified the kids that are moving into that chronic behavior issue realm? Or is it a problem with how we're delivering the interventions? So we're going to be looking at what we're delivering and how we're doing it, and we're going to adjust. If it's a question of instruction, teaching our staff or teaching our students or building fluency of our staff and students, then we're going to work with that Tier 1 system again to make sure that we're teaching everybody that needs to know and making sure that they're doing it the way it's intended. We're also going to have a data rule that talks about the student that's not responding. So if the student is not responding, we're going to have data that shows us the patterns. We're going to see, are we seeing the problem behavior across all settings, which may tell us, that this is kind of a skill issue. We don't know how to be safe throughout the course of the day. We need additional practice, additional instruction, or it may be within certain settings where, we have a pretty good idea of how to do this particular behavior, but in a given location, there might be some things that are interfering with us being able to consistently demonstrate it. So that's going to help us figure out what comes next. The data from our universal, the data from our gateway intervention. Over the next couple sessions, we're going to unpack SAIG, we're going to unpack mentoring, we're going to unpack individualized check-in, check-out. But the data is going to help us figure out the next step. We're also going to have the data rule that tells us if the intervention is working. And if we're seeing the intervention work, then that is our prompt as a system to fade support. The whole idea behind fading is to move the student into a self-monitoring realm. So they're going to rely less and less on the environment, less and less on the adults, less and less on the feedback and the acknowledgement, and really moving them to that ability to read environmental cues and adjust their behavior without prompting from staff. As we talk about check in, check out in just a minute, there's some things that we can anticipate around self-monitoring that we can plan for, including the student that responds to the structure of the daily progress report. So we'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. But the last thing with this chart that we really wanted to kind of key in on is this problem-solving piece. And the problem-solving team really exists to start looking at how do we support one student at a time? What do we need to do different for them? How do we need to support them? But that's one of those things, the majority of the time, that we're not going to move to for students in Tier 2 until we've seen that some of the basic interventions have not worked.
Hey, Kent, can I just go back to that for one quick second?
Sure.
And I know you touched on this already, but I just, last week, one of our colleagues, Kent and I work with another wonderful colleague, we were doing some math, just kind of theoretically, you know, based on the recommendation, like Kent said, we really are looking for a 70% response rate in these interventions. And that we want to do, you know, we want to provide what we say we're providing, right? You know, we want to have a really good, solid check-in, check-out. We really want to have a solid social, academic, instructional group process. And so if we really have a 70 response rate to check-in, check-out, and at least one other intervention that a student could have access to and receive and actually make progress from, man, the number that of students that really actually would need that individualized problem solving, kind of in that orange, is so few. It drops dramatically, and it for me it really helps to put this in perspective, because if we kind of do that math, sometimes we jump, because the old practice was jump from what's happening in the classroom or in school-wide environment to the problem-solving team. Sometimes we still have this gut reaction that if something's not working, then right away we want to jump to that problem-solving team, or we want to go there too quickly because that's kind of where we're comfortable and what we're used to. And if we can trust the process and really refine those interventions, make sure we've got in place what we planned on, what we know is effective, then really that problem-solving team should be saved for just really a handful of students that need that additional, more targeted, individualized support. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I know you touched on it, but it was really eye-opening to me when last week a couple of us kind of dug into some data in a sample school and trying to get more concrete about that. And it really does kind of help lighten the pressure off of that problem-solving team and what they might need to do. Again, long-term thinking, as we're building these interventions, it might not be a perfect scenario, but that's kind of the goal, is that that's saved for just that handful of students that would need that past those lower-level interventions.
Yeah, it's a really good point to clarify and unpack, because when you start looking at what those intensive interventions are, the amount of time it takes to set up and deliver and maintain is pretty considerable. So we want to be
absolutely.
We want to be able to do that with our resources and do it well, rather than doing it for a lot of kids halfway.
Right. And I know we have somebody on here, Stacy, I know you, there have been some side conversations related to Tier 3 implementation, I know, happening in your district. And I just wanted to point that out, that we have to make sure this is so solid, because like Ken just said, the intensity of those even just within that problem solving team, the intensity of that plan is much more targeted. It's much more specific. And then you layer on tier 3 with that, and holy cow, I mean, that is a lot of work. And so we want to make sure that stuff in the yellow right there is solidly in place. Otherwise, we're kind of set up to fail. Our system is just, it's not set up to provide those higher level supports to more than a handful of kids, more than a few kids, because it's just, we're not going to be able to do it well. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Before we jump into kind of the structure pieces, any questions, anything people want to ask or contribute or challenge? If you're going to challenge it, Emilie can take it. That was funnier in my head.
Kent's really good at banter, though, so he's always up for that kind of stuff. Stacy, Elena, Kathleen, how's this all sitting for you?
Makes sense.
Okay.
Yep, I'm good.
Excellent.
Cool.
Yep, me too.
Like I said, if anything comes up, shout at us, stop us. So the next part we want to talk about is really the flow, the collaboration structures at tier 2, and actually moving into some of the tier 3, high tier 2, low tier 3 pieces as well. And that's, how do we deliver this? How do we structure this? How do we provide that accountability and the logistical support? And depending on how you trained, when you trained, or even the material that was used, this was a place that things got really murky, because we've talked in the past about coaches or system leaders or facilitators, coordinators, and really what we wanted to do was kind of clean this up and get people moving beyond thinking about titles to really thinking about the functions that need to be covered within those teams. So at tier 2, the first thing that we talk about is really the person that's in charge of tier 2. You can call him a coach, you can call him an external coach, you can call him the tier 2 facilitator, whatever the language is that works in your district and your building, cool, right? We've kind of moved away from language of coach because of contracts and all that kind of stuff. Really what we're interested in from a function standpoint is making sure that your tier 2 systems have somebody in charge of really overseeing all of the other aspects. When we meet as a team, are we looking at the data? Are we delivering the interventions? Do we have enough people lined up to provide the interventions? All of those sort of logistical aspects. The tier 2 person that's overseeing tier 2 also is going to kind of help serve as that conduit when we have to go back to tier 1 to teach staff, to build fluency with the students. Anytime that there's a kind of an education need, they're going to be working with that tier 1 system to help make sure that the education is being provided. Who delivers it, how it's delivered, those are all contextual fit pieces. But really, when we are talking about this tier 2 leader, they're kind of holding the umbrella over everything else that's happening. They're not necessarily delivering anything. They're not necessarily responsible for development of things. They're there to make sure that all of the work that needs to happen is actually getting done. The second layer is the intervention coordination itself. So aside from looking at the overall tier 2 system, we want to make sure that each intervention that is put into place has somebody that's overseeing that particular intervention. Are we orienting the students to how the intervention is delivered? Do we have enough people lined up to deliver the intervention? Have we communicated with families what the intervention intention is? Are we looking at not only the data of students coming in and going out, but they're also going to be the ones that are responsible to make sure that we are looking at the 70%. The coordinator, again, like the tier 2 overseer, leader, coach, whatever you call them, the tier 2, the intervention coordinator is also not by default the one that's going to be delivering the interventions. They may, if that's the way that your building, your district works. But the idea of the coordinator is to really kind of start honing our attention in to that specific thing. Do we have all of the pieces operating the way that they're intended to? The last piece within the intervention framework are the people that are delivering the interventions. You can call them greeters, you can call them facilitators, you can call them anything that makes sense. If you have language in your building for academic interventions, your behavior interventions may mirror that language. But really at this point, what we're wanting to make sure is that at this level, the interventions are being delivered the way that they're designed by the people that they're designed for. So with check-in, check-out, they're check-in, check-out facilitators, check-in, check-out greeters, check-in, check-out whatever. Their role, based on how you set this up, is to take care of the greeting and the organization stuff for the student in the morning when they get there, to capture data and process the student's day with them at the end of the day. So do we have all of the people that are identified as greeters doing this the same way? And that's what the coordinator is there to ensure. If we have 15 greeters, that the 15 greeters are doing things the way that they're supposed to be doing them. When we talk about SAIG, those social academic instruction groups, this is where you're going to have that contextual fit again. So ideally, the SAIG instruction is happening in the environment by the person responsible for the environment, right? Because they're going to be the one giving the student feedback, helping them with skill acquisition. If we can't do it in the setting by the person responsible, then the coordinator is going to work with the people that make sense to do it to make sure that we're teaching it as close to that way as possible and making sure that feedback is being delivered the right way. So the coordinator is there as a check and balance to make sure that the interventions are delivered with integrity the way that they're intended. They may or may not be the ones that are delivering the intervention, which is its own separate function. Emilie, anything you want to add based on kind of your neck of the woods?
No, I mean, I guess the biggest thing I would just, the other thing I just wanted to pull out from what you were saying was that consistency piece and delivery, and how are those coordinators providing supports, ongoing professional development, ongoing just collaboration or communication with all of those facilitators. Maybe that's being done by the systems team leader, or maybe that's done within the intervention coordinators, like that, those yellow boxes that you see on the screen. But kind of like Kent said, like, are they, is there an opportunity to kind of recalibrate? And is everybody kind of still thinking about delivering the intervention in the same way? And how are things working? And what additional supports would be helpful? Or is the time working out? Do we need more time? Do we need less time? Do we need more adults involved? Are we able to provide communication from the kind of about the interventions to classroom teachers, to families? And so I think that's a really key piece in terms of that ongoing support those facilitators in particular need to make sure that they know their role, because those facilitators may or may not have been at training. They might have not been at Tier 2 training. Some of the best facilitators of check and check out, or the best greeters that I know, have been kind of those what do they call them? So, school engineers or janitors, kind of the groundskeeper type of people, And so if they weren't at Tier 2 training, how do we help keep them supported if they're not at the team meetings, or if they're not at perhaps even at staff meetings? How do we kind of keep them involved? So just some food for thought in terms of that ongoing development of your people, your personnel. That's all.
Thanks. This structure, making sure that we have eyes on and that we have the consistency and that we have people identified to deliver, is going to be a structure that's going to play through Tier 2 and Tier 3 as well. So when we start moving into Tier 3, we're going to have that same kind of system conversation. We're still going to be looking at people needs. We're still going to be looking at all of that infrastructure. And we're going to have people identified who are going to be the ones that are facilitating the wraparound teams. We're going to have people identified that are going to facilitate the renew process, or that are going to facilitate the complex FBA process. So really, if your school has been kind of trying to figure out who is responsible, what do they do, how do we do this, this is going to be a place that is going to be a good investment as you start thinking about moving into Tier 3 eventually. This piece needs to be really, really solid, because it's going to pay off as you move into that Tier 3 realm. So that brings us to starting to unpack some of the interventions. And we wanted to make sure that we talked about some of the infrastructure before we moved into check and check out, because honestly, check and check out, or those gateway interventions, have been it's been pretty easy for schools to get that first layer of support in place. So we want to just make sure that we're spending some time talking about it to review and be able to troubleshoot. But today really was kind of looking at those infrastructure and support pieces. Now we'll start moving to the interventions. So earlier, Emilie and I had talked about that focus on efficiency and effectiveness, that we're wanting to make sure that we have a process in place that's going to work for the majority of students to not only get them to support, but also essentially limit the number of students that are needing that higher intensity intervention. And when I say limiting it, it's not that we're sitting down and having a conversation saying, no, I'm sorry, we've reached our fill, we can't take any more kids in this intervention. Limiting means we're setting up the layers of support that are going to catch increasing number of students. So the more support they need, the more access to intervention that they're going to have. The better we're delivering those interventions, the fewer students are going to end up needing that higher intensity support. So as we start thinking about this from a structural standpoint, we want to use our universal data to identify really what's our main need. Most schools are going to go into this first layer of Tier 2 support with check in, check out. The idea behind check in, check out is that it is easy to do. It doesn't really add a lot at all to the classroom teacher's day, because they're already processing behavior. You know, we're providing a form and we're going to spend 30 seconds talking about, how the student met expectations over the course of the day. Really, check in, check out is just additional feedback and additional support that we've already been doing at Tier 1. We're not teaching anything new. We're just giving that increased rate of feedback and increased rate of acknowledgement based on increased opportunities to practice. So most schools elect to create check in, check out as that gateway. When we think about the structure of it, this is pretty straightforward. The schools that implement check in, check out follow the same kind of cycle for the student. The student comes to school in the morning, they meet with their greeter, the greeter makes sure that they have everything that they need throughout the course of the day. Do you have your assignment notebook? Do you have your homework to turn in? Do you have pencils? So we're doing some prevention as a greeter to make sure that we're not going to have any unanticipated obstacles that pop up. But we're also kind of using this time to help the students settle in and kind of give them a soft landing. So the greeter aids in transition from home and community and helps the student kind of get in the groove of the academic setting. As the student goes throughout their day, they're meeting with their teacher at the end of each transition period to talk about how well the student met expectation, and we'll kind of talk through the scoring and the DPR in just a second. At the end of the day, the student checks out with their greeter, making sure they have their homework, making sure they have everything they need to take home, and kind of processing any big events of the day. The day went really, really well, or, I had to talk to my teacher about this particular behavior, but it's really not intended for the check and check out greeter to be a disciplinarian. They're not there to provide consequence for the student. They're really there to capture the data and help close out the day for the student and kind of pre-correct what the next day is going to look like. The student goes home, and if we have built our system right, the families know how to talk with their student, what it means to do the processing, and if we're asking them to do any pre-teaching for the next day, that'll happen before the student leaves for school the next day. So the cycle will continue over the course of your intervention window. However long, however many weeks you've decided to create your system, usually it's a 4 to 6 week period of time. The system conversation throughout the cycle is going to continue to operate. So your team, your Tier 2 team, is going to be looking at all of the check and check out data for all of the kids in check and check out every time that your system team meets. So sometimes we might have 8 kids in check and check out, sometimes we may have 15 kids in check and check out, depending on where we are in our cycle, depending on how many students have been faded or how many kids have just come in. The system conversation is always going to be the same. Do we have enough greeters for the students that are coming in? Are we seeing the students that are in intervention responding to the intervention? So that 70% rule. Do we have students that are fading? One thing that I am going to encourage you, especially for this gateway intervention piece, is to make sure that your Tier 2 team is looking at the number of students that are coming in. Because if all of a sudden you're getting a crush of students that are now all of a sudden qualifying for check-in, check-out, or whatever your gateway intervention is, what you've got to make sure that you're doing is having that conversation with Tier 1. Because our systems at Tier 2 are not built for large numbers of students. Our Tier 2 and Tier 3 systems are built to support the few students that are not responding. So if we're seeing that crush, if we're starting to see large numbers that are becoming eligible for support, we need to go back to that Tier 1 system and say, ooh, have y'all taken a look at this? Something's going on. We've got a large number of kids coming in. What do we need to reteach? What do we need to do boosters with? We're going to do ongoing progress monitoring for the students that are in the intervention. So as a student is reaching our data rule for responding, we're going to start our fading process. If we're seeing a student coming close to the end of the intervention window and we're not seeing progress, we're going to start our process for layering on support. So the cycle is going to continue for the student and for the life of your Tier 2 team, looking not only at the student and the student data, but also the intervention that we're delivering from a system standpoint. Emilie, anything you want to add before I jump on?
Nope, I think that was it. Thank you.
The other thing that I want to make sure that we're calling out here is culturally responsive practices, especially as we're starting to talk about access to intervention. We always want to make sure that we are looking at our Tier 1 system, especially from that large number conversation. Part of what we need to be looking at are our risk ratios. So looking at the number of students that are reaching eligibility for Tier 2 support. Are we seeing a nice cross-section of our student population, or are we seeing, for example, our students of color being over-identified as needing the intervention, or our students with disabilities being over-identified as needing the intervention? The risk ratio allows us to determine how well our universal is functioning. If we're seeing patterns, and the patterns that I'm talking about are well researched, Russ Skiba, in a research article called Race is Not Neutral, documented a pattern nationwide of schools that are doing PBIS that showed students of color were getting referred at a disproportionately high rate for subjective behaviors, whereas white students get referral for objective behaviors. So objective behaviors are things like fighting, attendance issues, weapons and drug possession. Subjective behaviors are things like defiance and disrespect. So point number one with this pattern to look at is who's getting referred for Tier 2 support, who's getting identified for it, and what are the behaviors that are getting referred for. For our Tier 2 systems to work, we need to make sure that students are getting access to that high quality instruction at Tier 1, that we're teaching to fluency. This is important because if what's happening is students of color are getting referred to check and check out for things like, defiance and disrespect, for those subjective behaviors, the interventions like check and check out or SAIG are not going to be as effective as we would hope, because we haven't taught the student how to code switch if it is a cultural mismatch. So when we talk about things like defiance and disrespect, there's communication patterns that the student might use at home, that they might use in their community, that don't necessarily match the academic world, right? Students that practice overlap is a communication pattern at home. When their mom's talking, if they're really excited, they might jump in and start saying, yeah, I agree, this is what I did, or this is how I see it. And if we don't teach students to raise their hand in the classroom, and we don't teach it to fluency, and we don't teach the why, we just assume every kid does that, this is where we have a mismatch. And if we have a kid that is constantly blurting out because it's what they know, and we haven't taught them the functional equivalent in our setting, then check in, check out's not going to make that big of a difference because we haven't taught the student the skill in the school setting to be successful. So we really want to make sure that we're looking at our discipline data, we're looking for those disproportionate patterns to make sure that we're identifying the right students that are needing the right support and not just making an assumption. Which brings us to providing that behavior feedback. So schools that have been implementing check-in, check-out have a daily progress report. There's a couple things that I want to key in on this example. There's some things that were going really well with this, right? So we see the daily progress report is aligning to the school-wide expectations. Respect property, respect all others, respect learning. Cool. We have the day divided by subject area and transition period. And ideally, we are teaching what respect property in the homeroom looks like, what respecting learning looks like in language arts class. So what we're doing through check and check out and on the DPR is giving the student feedback on how well they met expectation. What I am not that fond of with this form is the key of 2, 1, and 0. 2 is not doing a great job. 1 is not okay, and 0 is not tough. The reason that we have a 2, 1, 0 system set up on the DPR is to help give the student feedback on how well they're demonstrating the skill. 2 really is the student is demonstrating the expected behavior. They are showing the same behavior in that setting around what respect looks like, what responsibility looks like, that everybody else in the classroom is demonstrating. 1 means there was an approximation. So 1 means everything from the student had to be reminded a couple times, but when they were reminded, they turned their behavior around. Or they started out and they had a giant, there was a behavior error at the start of the class period, but the student caught themselves and they corrected their behavior, right? 1 means we saw some form, some approximation, some glimmer of that behavior that we were expecting. And a 1 is okay, because what we're doing is teaching the student how to self-monitor, how to correct their own behavior based on feedback. 0 means I didn't see it. So we want to make sure that 2, 1, 0 is really focused on the skill acquisition and not on kind of a judgment of the student's character. Oh, you had a really tough period. That's not helpful in how the student acquires or generalizes skill. Great job while it might feel good when we get that attaboy, good job, way to go, while it might feel good, we also want to make sure that we're being behaviorally specific and we're not holding the student to a higher standard than we hold everybody else in the class who is not in check-in, check-out or not in an intervention. So 210, the science behind it is how we help give the students feedback to acquire the skill. 2, I saw it, that's what I'm looking for, nice job. 1, there were some approximations you corrected, nice job doing that. 0, I didn't see it. We also want to avoid a Likert scale, right? We don't want to give 5 options. We don't want to give 10 options. It might feel better than 210 for us as staff, but from a functional standpoint, how do we teach a student the difference between a 9 and a 7? How do we teach our staff a difference between a 10 and an 8, right? If we're looking at skill acquisition, I saw it, I saw some type of it, I didn't see it. So that's why it's built around that 210 and how we want to make sure that we're giving that feedback. Emilie, anything to add?
No, I think you hit it on the head. I think that a lot of times people see that 0, 1, 2 scale and want to equate that either negatively, and focusing on either the absence of negative behaviors or, how often kind of that problem behavior is demonstrated versus thinking about it like, was the student getting close? Like Kent said, is it an approximation of what we want to see that student demonstrate? And then that 2 is not the above and beyond. It's not the like, wow, you had a perfect period. It's the what we would expect from any of the other kids within the classroom, to function pro-socially and, navigate their environment in a safe, respectful, and responsible way. And I think, it's really helpful, especially if you've been implementing a couple of years, it's really helpful to kind of go back to the staff and, again, like recalibrate, just like you do with those who deliver the intervention, those greeters or those social academic instructional groups, facilitators, to kind of go back to the staff and say, how are we all perceiving this? And what's a good example of some positive comments on the DPR, and maybe, where are we kind of falling short, so that we all develop this common understanding and use of this progress monitoring tool and the intervention behind it, that frequent feedback, that support to self-monitoring, and helping that student really internalize and learn that new skill. And that, I think, just comes, again, with just some good ongoing professional development, that it's not this one and done and we assume all teachers are on board and, oh, we did that last year and now 20% of our teachers are new. Like, we have to kind of go back to the drawing board, and not back to the drawing board and start from scratch, but, kind of have that ongoing living conversation that this is critical and something that should be happening consistently by every teacher in every environment. So, yeah.
The other thing that's probably worth touching on is kind of where ODR and minor interact with daily progress report. And this is also, again, where, depending on how long you've been implementing and where you got the training and which model you were trained under and all of that, 210 is not synonymous with ODRs and minors. ODRs, minors, those measures of behavior error at Tier 1 are going to be corrected as a part of that Tier 1. So if we're documenting a minor incident, we're documenting that we had to reteach that particular behavior, and reteaching means the student kind of knows what they did that was an error, they know the right way to do it, they were able to discuss it or demonstrate it, and they had a small response cost. ODR means a big behavior occurred, we involved the administration, or we had notified the administration that this thing had occurred, and they're aware and they're dealing with stuff. Those do not equate to scores on the DPR. If we had a kid that got in a fight in the hall, right before my language arts class. And our building says that a fight in the hall is going to equate to an office discipline referral. That process has run its course. The kid may come into our language arts class and be able to earn all of their points because they were respectful, responsible, safe in that classroom. They might have blurted out in my class, and I might have had to reteach, and I may have treated this as a minor incident and documented it, and they earned a 1 because after I retaught, they turned the behavior around and we didn't see any more of this. So we've got to be very careful to make sure that staff are clear when behavior occurs. We're going to correct it at Tier 1 as a part of our Tier 1 process, because that's what ODR and minor is, right? We're documenting behavior error. The DPR in the feedback at Tier 2 is about measuring the fluency of behavior across the different settings. So just like we would do something like progress monitoring reading, we're doing the same kind of thing with our Tier 1 data and our Tier 2 data. So they're related to each other, but they are not in lockstep with each other. ODR does not equal 0. So that gets us to kind of the end of the session, at least the formal part, and really wanted to make sure that we gave you a chance to share any thoughts, ask any questions, share resources with each other, kind of anything like that. If anything comes up, also please feel free to get a hold of us, get a hold of your regional tax for behavior or academic, and make sure that you are doing your system assessments, self-assessment, and you've got your BOQ TFI scheduled. So thoughts, questions, closing thoughts from Emilie.
I got nothing. I'm wondering if Heather, Elena, Elena, Kathleen, or Stacy have any questions or thoughts, or would like, I guess, any thoughts on needs for future sessions, or even just follow up from one of our colleagues or one of us, as technical assistance coordinators to support your implementation.
Well, I have a question about the check-in, check-out sheet. When we were watching the one with the languages that were used, we have one at our elementary school with the smiley face and the straight face and the frowny face. At the middle high school level, it would probably just be for 7th and 8th graders. Would you recommend using language next to the numbers, or just leave the numbers there as is?
So the idea behind symbols for an elementary school is to kind of help the student understand what the symbol is communicating. I'm not necessarily a fan of smiley and frowny faces, because that's also kind of communicating that judgment.
Right.
But if that's kind of what you're choosing to do, cool. At the middle school, high school, I would make it just be the numbers.
Okay.
And orient the student when they are beginning the intervention of what the numbers mean.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
I guess one thing I'm starting to wonder, and my team and I at one of our schools are trying to coming up with our specific data rules to go into Tier 2. We do have a few kids in check-in and check-out, but it's mostly been because of teacher referral, or they were written up a lot last year, so we wanted to start them this year, just creating a positive relationship with a different adult. So I'm just kind of looking for more resources or more direction on how to make these specific data rules and how to start implementing those into our Tier 2 systems.
Good questions. Emilie,
Yeah.
you want to take it, or you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, here's just a couple of thoughts. I think, I really appreciate the question or the thinking behind, last year was maybe presented a lot of challenges for a few students. And so we want to start them off on the right foot this year. I think that's great. I mean, I think, a big tenet of PBIS is if you can predict it, you can prevent it. And so, I think kind of coming from that mindset just from last year into this year um, it's great. We don't want to just kind of wait to fail. That's what we're trying to kind of work against with PBIS. And if we have an indication that last year, a student was struggling or still trying to learn some of those new skills and replace some old skills that were working for them, and in maybe not the most positive way, then great. I definitely like that you're thinking a little bit, kind of wanting to push your team into some more concrete data rules, because I think that will help guide the process a little bit and give it a little bit more structure than just open-ended teacher referrals, which can be very valuable, but oftentimes we risk falling into the trap of, kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the teachers who are, thoughtful or remember or are probably more frustrated or, it's kind of left to chance who gets referred then. So when you look at your data rules, I'd really look at your tier one data. I mean, your data rules are going to really start there. So you really want to examine what's the data coming in from our tier one in terms of majors, minors. We could even examine attendance or health room visits, kids who go to the nurse's office or, want to go see the social worker, but there's really not anything definitive wrong. They're just, they're not feeling so hot and they kind of want to get out of class for a little bit. That psychosomatic kind of complaints that might happen. So where do those lie within our data system at tier one, or are we collecting those? And then for tier two, typically, most schools, what I see is it's usually, 2 to 3 minors in a set period of time, like the last 2 to 4 weeks or something, depending on what their data system looks like or their data collection looks like at tier one. And then I would really encourage that, if a student's receiving 1 or 2 majors are a pretty big deal. That means the kid's been removed from class, they've been sent to the office. It was a pretty big deal thing. And so I'd really look at plugging them into some tier 2 supports right away and looking at, how do we make this an efficient process? So it kind of goes beyond that initial, 3 minors in a month equals intervention, but it also then goes to, can we support them with interventions in a short period of time? Can we give them access within a few days, or do we have to wait a long time? So I don't know if that's really helpful. I would start with your tier one data, but then usually what I see schools kind of going with is that kind of 3 minors in a month or 1 major, and students receive interventions as quickly as they possibly can so that we can prevent further problem behaviors in the future. Does that help?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was a fantastic question and a fantastic answer. The only thing I'm going to add is around this teacher referral thing. In my neck of the woods, schools that have trained tier 2 that are beginning to implement tier 2, I've probably got about 50% that started with some form of a teacher referral. And kind of the secret to that is getting the teachers to think beyond just signing the kid up. Why are they concerned? What's making them concerned? And use that as kind of that initial documentation. So if you're not comfortable, if you're not convinced your data system is firing the way that it should right off the bat, that teacher referral is a great way to start identifying students, but we need to be able to measure what improvement looks like. So if you're doing like a teacher referral form, you may want to consider adding a prompt to that. Why are you concerned about that student, and what does that concern look like? The kid is, 3 times a week the kid is hanging out on the wall at recess rather than playing with peers. or, the student is always going to visit the social worker, the counselor, 3 times a week, and it's always right before, language art class or FIAD or whatever. Try to get them to start thinking about quantifying why they're concerned. Because that's part of how you're going to want to progress monitor too. If you're one getting better, and that can take any number of forms.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I think for me, it was more of just taking that information and looking at our processes and looking at what we need to improve upon and what we're missing. So I don't have any questions necessarily, but it was very thought-provoking.
Good. That's what we're hoping for. Yay! And Kathleen said thanks, but Kathleen logged off.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I mean, we are around. If you have questions, you can always feel free to reach out to Kent or I, or your technical assistance coordinator that supports your region. We are more than happy to help troubleshoot or just bounce ideas off of and kind of steer your team in the right direction.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.